Hello and welcome to the Greenlight Guru True Quality Virtual Summit, the 3-day event designed to provide actionable takeaways you can implement in your own company to innovate faster, stay ahead of regulatory changes, and use quality as a strategic asset to grow your device business. This session is on when to flip the switch, balancing late feasibility and early design controls. My name is Wade Schrader, Medical Device Guru here at Greenlight Guru, and I will be your moderator for today's event. Let's get right into it. We've got a special session scheduled for you today. I know our speakers, Jamison Float and Chad Gibson, are really looking forward to exploring the many facets of late feasibility and early design controls while sharing a practical approach to flipping the switch between unregulated and regulated phases of a medical device development program. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our speakers and their companies, Priority Designs and CMD MedTech, I'm going to touch on a few items real quick. First, this session is going to run for about 45 minutes in total and will include a Q&A session at the end where Jamison and Chad have been kind enough to answer your questions. So I encourage you to submit your questions throughout the presentation as they come up in the box on the right-hand side, and we will get to as many of them as time permits. This entire session will be recorded. Once this session wraps up, there's a 10-minute break before the next live session begins. If you're interested in learning design considerations to maximize medical device cloud connectivity, I encourage you to make sure you're registered for the following session and use your unique link to tune in. If you aren't already signed up, you can register for the next session and over 20 others at virtual-summit.greenlight.guru. I'd like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on this free virtual summit. If you've been on one of our training sessions before, then you know we put these on because improving the quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru. Likely a similar mission as many of you at today's summit. Anything we can do as an organization that helps device makers bring safer, life-changing devices to market quicker and with less risk aligns with that mission. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting free events and training sessions, through partnering with world-class medical device companies like Priority Designs, or through our award-winning medical device QMS software. If you'd like to learn more about why medical device companies from across the globe are moving away from paper-based general-purpose quality management systems and adopting our purpose-built medical device quality management software, I encourage you to head over to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation to schedule your free personalized one-on-one demo. In doing so, you'll learn how the very best medical device companies are leveraging our purpose-built quality management software to gain ISO 13485 certification, market approval, breeze through audits, and push beyond just compliance to produce true quality medical devices. So if you're interested in learning how we can help your device company, make sure you visit www.greenlight.guru after today's webinar and schedule your personalized demo. Now, on to the bulk of today's presentation. Let me give a proper introduction to our speakers today. Jamison Float is a senior biomedical engineer at Priority Designs, a product development company with full service capabilities spanning the entire medical product development process, from initial human factors and usability to design and development to verification and validation. Greenlight Guru is also proud to have Priority Designs as a customer. Jamison has over 20 years experience in product development in both corporate and consultancy roles. He has operated simultaneously and exclusively as a lead development engineer and project manager, developing products in the sporting goods, protective gear, medical, wearables, consumer, and industrial categories. Projects under Mr. Float's leadership have ranged from complete turnkey development to any specific phase work, including strategy ideation, proof of concept development, development engineering, manufacturing readiness, user research, clinical evaluation, regulatory documentation, and more. Mr. Float has engineered a variety of mechanical, electromechanical, electrical, and connected product solutions and designed for a wide variety of materials, fabrication, and assembly processes. He is joined by Chad Gibson, managing partner at CMD MedTech, which provides medical device leadership expertise in the areas of system engineering, regulatory and quality, project management, and design and development. Chad has over 20 years of medical device development experience. His background includes system engineering, regulatory and quality, and Six Sigma. He earned his degree and started his career in medical device, electrical, and software engineering. He has the RAPS RAC and ASQ CQA certifications. Chad is an inventor on 15 US patents in the fields of medical devices and health software. So without further ado, let me hand it over to your presenters, Jamison Float and Chad Gibson.
All right, thanks everyone. Thanks, Wade. I think Wade did a great job of introducing myself. As he mentioned, I do have 20 years of medical device experience across a variety of different projects, from simple medical devices all the way to complex robotic systems. As Wade mentioned, CMD MedTech provides consulting services in the area of systems engineering, project management, regulatory and quality, and design and development engineering. So thanks everyone for joining us today. And I really look forward to sharing my experiences with everyone. Jameson?
Yes, excellent. Thank you very much for the introduction. Chad, nice to see you again. The introduction was great. Just real quick, Priority Designs, we're a product design firm. We started almost 30 years ago doing very traditional commercial product design projects, sporting goods, appliances, home and gardens. But over the last 10 years, we've taken on more and more medical clients. And about 2 years ago, we became ISO 13485 certified for design develop to actually execute more on these medical devices with medical device clients. For all of these clients, both our traditional and our medical clients, our goal is to provide them with the best support at the least cost. We consider ourselves to be the caretakers of our clients' budgets and partners in the development. And so to that point, for our medical products, we've taken 2 big steps that help save us time and costs. And they're actually both on this call. CMD MedTech, who is Chad and the company he runs, we partner with them to manage our quality system and provide us with regulatory support, systems engineering support, and really streamline our internal processes. We also use Greenlight Guru, as mentioned. They manage our documentation, help us execute our quality system, and it's allowed us to connect virtually with our clients, and also allowed CMD MedTech and Priority Designs to work seamlessly, even if we're not in the same location. So, it's been a really great collaboration that's actually saved us money for our clients.
Yep, as Jameson mentioned, we often collaborate together on projects to meet the needs of our mutual customers. So Priority Designs really complements our services and allows us to provide a broader offering to our medical device clients. So example, we're currently working on a project that brings together Priority's expertise in human factors and soft goods development with our expertise in regulatory and compliance to IEC 60601-1, that's a tongue twister, which is the standard for electrical medical equipment.
Right. So for us and our clients using CMD and Greenlight Guru really helps save time and money, and we pass that on to the clients. But the most important step is what we wanted to talk about right now. It's how do you decide when to transition from those late feasibility phases to formal design controls? And every client is unique. We deal with entrepreneurs that don't have any established quality system. We also deal with very large clients who have a very well-established quality system and either want us to use that, or more often, how do we sidestep that by using our quality system, because we can move a little bit more nimble and quicker.
Yep. So I think we're going to hit the topics now, but really, project cost, duration, and the quality of your project overall really comes down to how well you plan and manage the project, and specifically this phase we're going to talk about here, which is that late feasibility, early design controls phase. So Jameson, you want to hit some of the topics we're going to cover here?
Sure. So our goal today is to talk a little bit about this area between late feasibility and early design controls, or more accurately, how do you move between research and development? So some of those topics we want to talk about, and hopefully you leave with some answers. So the first is these traditional motivators for design controls. How is that determination made to enter design controls what drives this decision in different companies, whether they be large companies or small companies. The second is, how do you manage this balancing act between feasibility and design controls? What makes sense to put in earlier phases as opposed to later phases? And can you run both phases at the same time? There are tools that help us get the most out of the feasibility and design control phases. So over years, and this is really where CMD MedTech helps influence our product strategy, they've found a set of tools and techniques that help them work consistently and identify best practices from transitioning between here. And we'll discuss some of those during the presentation. And then finally, what are some recommended strategies for effectively managing this during R&D? These are the ways that Chad and I and our companies approach these activities in the early stage of development. So I'd like to share what I think works well, and Chad will do the same.
All right. So before we get too far into the conversation, I want to talk a little bit about the scope of what we're going to talk about. So, first of all, this presentation has a U.S.-centric approach, but I think a lot of these concepts can be applied to developing a medical device worldwide. So, particularly in the EU. Our discussion also focuses on medical devices, so we're not really talking about pharmaceutical development. But I think you can apply a lot of these concepts to combination product development, or really anything else where a device is in the loop and you're working in a regulated environment. Although some people may have different definitions of these terms, we're kind of using these terms interchangeably throughout the presentation. So when we say feasibility, generally we mean research. When we say design controls, we generally mean development. So I try to use feasibility and design controls more than research and development here. But if I move back and forth, just know that I mean the same thing. So this graphic on the right is really this area that we're talking about. Is really the overlap between feasibility and design controls. And in my experience, this is really the space where a lot of companies have trouble, understanding what it means to be in research versus what it means to be in development. And, how do we effectively manage those risks that pop up in this phase of the project? So let's dig right in.
So as we said, every company is unique, every project is unique, but there are kind of a consistent set of drivers that usually influence how a company decides to move and transition between feasibility and design controls. Chad, do you want to talk about each one of these?
Yeah. So, these are the things I see the most often, as being these big drivers. So the first one is business milestones. This one pops up a lot when we're working with, these larger, more established companies, and usually they have an embedded product development process or set of design development procedures that that really dictate what must be done before you enter design controls, or they have to be completed before you move to the next phase if you're using like a phase gate approach. And I find the effectiveness of these milestones are really dependent on how well the product development process has been fleshed out. How flexible it is for the differing nature and the different risk profiles of the products that go through the process. And sometimes it breaks down. So, imagine if you're a company that develops nothing but CT scanners, and suddenly you have this new product idea that comes along. It's a much lower safety risk profile, might be a lot simpler in terms of design complexity. So a lot of times, if your product development process isn't structured to handle that effectively, you might be placing more burden on your product and your project than's really necessary to make a safe and effective product. And so next is, I kind of lump these two together. Next is perceived project costs and the perceived time to market the development program is going to have. So cost and time, really flow together in a lot of ways, right? Time is money. So early on in development, we don't really have a firm grasp on how everything's going to shake out in terms of timeline or schedule or the resources that we need. And we're really working on our best educated guesses. And so a lot of times there's a perception that spending too much time outside of design controls, is not a good thing. That feasibility is a waste of time. We're really not progressing towards, say, we have an internal milestone of like we gotta have a product launched by spring of 2022, or we've got to hit this phase gate milestone that our director of engineering is saying we need to hit. We might have some competitors that are launching devices, or we have a trade show that we're trying to get a device to, something like that really pushes pushes a date versus, doing a good job at a bottoms-up approach of developing a schedule with dependencies, with some built-in slack for some risks that, if anyone's worked on a development program, there's always things that pop up that we didn't expect to pop up. So that one's a big driver as well. Internal domain. So I've seen a lot of project gating based on sort of the fiefdoms and the internal departments that collaborate to develop a project. So, sometimes there'll be like an early feasibility group, and then you'll have a separate sort of development group. And so a lot of times the transfer of that is sort of dictating when things happen and how they happen. A lot of times, marketing will own product pipelines. Market launches are associated with the timelines they set. And so it's a lot of times, fitting a square peg in a round hole. So, it's really difficult to estimate early on, but the more we can understand our risks and address risks, the better that we're able to schedule and plan ahead for these things. Company evaluation. So this is a big one with startups, in that, a lot of funding rounds are based on performance metrics like demonstration of a prototype or some technical feasibility, or even a 510K clearance. So a lot of times evaluation is based heavily on that. And then when companies have a goal of acquisition, the focus isn't necessarily on predictability, but, it's really achieving those milestones, right? So how can we get to this milestone with the minimal cost and time that we can do? So, this is kind of an interesting challenge in terms of managing all the different risks, whether it's safety risks or technical risks, business risks, all these different types of risks, while trying to be very nimble and efficient and spending those startup funds efficiently. And then the last one here, risk benefit assessments. This is what we're going to talk about a lot in this presentation is, doing a risk benefit assessment of a lot of different areas of risk. So not just safety risk, which, anyone in the regulatory and quality space is familiar with doing a risk benefit assessment in terms of safety risk. But we're really looking a little broader than that. So technical risks, business risks, programmatic risks. And so, really what we want to do is figure out when that point in time is where, we sort of leave this feasibility phase and really get down to brass tacks and say, all right, we're gonna start moving through our formalized process. We've got our risk reduced to an acceptable level, and we're going to move forward with our final embodiment of the design.
Right. So all these drivers are important, and honestly, they're a very real part of every company and every project that we work on. But if we're just talking about the real goal being to improve the quality outputs of the project, while at the same time reducing the cost and the timing, they're not always the best metrics to use and often can lead you astray. So what should we be focusing on if we want to maximize the value from our feasibility and design control phases?
Yep. So if there's something that Jamison and I want you to leave with today, it's to have a better understanding, or at least a set of tools that you can use to really maximize the value that you get out of both of these phases. So maximizing the value of the feasibility phase, maximizing the value of the design controls phases. And, really spending the right money, time, resources at the right time is, really what we want you to leave here with. These phases aren't mutually exclusive too. So we want to be clear there in that, you can still stay in feasibility for some elements, but may move into design control for other elements. So it's not necessarily a hard stop. And we'll talk a little bit about that more in here in a little bit.
Yeah, I love the image we have on the right, because it's a dog with the bone on his nose, or the treat on his nose, and he's just itching to take it. And sometimes that's what it feels like when we're trying to make this decision to flip the switch. And so we understand it takes a lot of patience and deliberance, but what are the real factors that you're trying to balance here that should be determining how you flip this switch?
Yep. And so, these are the ones that I find to be pretty much common throughout any medical device program, and sort of this balancing act that you're going to do with all these different factors that more times than not all compete with each other. Minimizing regulatory and compliance risk, that should be pretty obvious. We don't want any risk in our 510K clearance process and our PMA process, whatever it might be. So what can we do to reduce the uncertainty that FDA is going to disagree with some elements in our 510K, or maybe have an issue post-market once our devices are out in the field. Safety risks. Obviously, we want to reduce our safety risks as much as possible. Related to that, clinical benefit. So we want to maximize the benefit of this device to the patients, to the caregivers, while minimizing the safety risk. And sometimes you have to make trade-offs, but at the end of the day, ultimately our benefits of the device must outweigh the risks of the device. And so we're playing a trade-off game in those two areas. Minimizing costs and time to market. So, in most all cases of medical device development, we're developing this product for a company that needs to have a return on R&D costs. So the more efficient we can be at balancing all these things, the better. Really the biggest derailer of cost and time to market is uncertainty and these unforeseen risks that pop up late in your project. Kind of the dirty little secret, but something or at least most of medical device development projects need to do is maximize the income coming in from the development of this project. And, obviously that's plays in hand with minimizing costs as well. But, if we're not turning a profit on these devices, we can't build and improve on those devices and make even more effective, even safer products that go out on the market. So on top of balancing all these, there are usually always other internal goals that can either support or not support some of these other metrics. So, I mentioned the startup acquisition goals as an example. There could be phase gate goals that we have to meet. Sometimes companies will put in place higher stringencies, higher levels of safety, which is always a great thing, but those are always things that come into play here as we try to figure out what the sweet spot is for optimizing all these things and getting the device on the market as quickly and as efficiently as possible.
Right. There's a fundamental assumption that faster is better, and the quicker you can move through the earlier phases, the quicker you'll get to the finish line. And that's true with the design controls. The quicker we turn those on, the quicker we transfer into the later phases, the faster we'll finish the project, and the quicker we'll realize all of these profits. But that's not always true. Sometimes a little extra work up front, a little more time mitigating some of those early risks saves time and money over the life of the entire project.
Yeah, exactly. So these charts that we're showing here are from a paper by Eric Honor called Understanding the Value of Systems Engineering. So this isn't necessarily a system engineering talk we're having here, but I think this principle really applies to developing a great plan for these phases of a project between late feasibility and early design controls. And I really want to focus here on figure 2. I don't know if I can. I guess I can't circle it. Nope. Well, okay. So look at figure 2, where we show this risk versus time chart. So the top chart here, we sort of have this slow-moving curve of risk that bubbles up and eventually dies down and gets lower by the time we launch a product. Our proposal in this presentation and what we've seen happen in practice is that if we spend a little more time earlier on, and in a project earlier on, in this case is working in that phase of late feasibility, early design controls, is really an effective way of finding and addressing and mitigating these risks earlier on, so that they don't pop up in the middle of design verification, or having to deal with them later when it's more expensive in a lot of ways to deal with them. This is kind of our version of flattening the curve in the medical device development space. So in Eric's paper, he benchmarked a lot of different projects of varying sizes and different complexities and found that with objective data, so objective evidence, he showed that projects that applied more diligence early on in a development effort in mitigating those risks were more predictable and had lower overall costs of development, sort of scaled for the complexity.
And it's not just spending more time in these phases, it's spending more targeted, deliberate time in these phases by using those early phases to resolve and mitigate what might later come up and bite you. That's what actually saves the time. So it's not just extended feasibility, it's not just spinning your wheels for longer, it's being very deliberate and tactical about that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And the tough sell is there's this mentality that if we're not progressing and we're not hitting these major milestones in design controls, we're not spending money wisely. And so that's the tough sell. And so what we're going to do is we're going to give you those tools and those ways to demonstrate this, to illustrate this to your stakeholders. And we don't want we don't want you to think that it's expensive because of design controls themselves. It's expensive because you put in a lot of work, and you put in a lot of work under a formal quality system that you might have to go back and change if you didn't discover these risks early on. So an extreme example, you may have developed some pre-production units for, let's say like a cardiac ablation device. And then you find out during your summative evaluation that, oh gosh, we thought doctors were the primary users of this device, but it actually turns out that the OR nurses are the primary users of the device. So, think about all you'd have to do to go back and maybe change the user interface, change how people use it, redo your software, go through verification again. It's a major hit to the program. Whereas if you discovered this earlier in feasibility, you can be a lot more nimble and efficient and sort of design out that issue before you put pen to paper or put software code in your system.
There's a lot of art and science or a lot of art to how to manage this risk and how to know when you're at an appropriate level of risk to be able to move forward. And I think kind of one of the rules of thumb that I use and that we've used is are the activities, particularly as you see in this chart in the green and the red, are they predictable? And are they predictable to a level of confidence where you feel comfortable quoting both the time and cost to execute them? If you don't, your risk and hence your uncertainty is probably still too high. So the more effort spent in the yellow, pulling down that risk, the more likely your activities are predictable moving forward, which allows you to expediently, efficiently move through them.
Yep. And so this is a great paper. I recommend anybody who wants to check this out in further detail. I've got the source down here below. So I want to talk a little bit about, what is the tool that we can manage this process with? And I want to start out with the risk signal chart. This is by far my favorite early development tool. So this is a tool I've been using for probably 10 years or so. In its core, it's a really simple tool. Here's how it works. We list the risks that we identify on the very right column here, or I'm sorry, on the left column. And then we categorize them into some different categories, which I'll talk about here in a minute. And then what we do is for each of these risks, we assign a current risk status. So, where are we at today with this risk? I like to use just 3 risk categories: red, yellow, green, like a stoplight. I think 3 categories are sufficient and really give you a nice visual to share with the team as well. The rationale for rating column, this is what just describes why our current score is what it is. Minimum target status column. This is where we kind of set a target for whatever the phase is that we want to enter or exit. So, in this example, we're talking about entering design controls since that's really the focus of the talk. But you can use this for any phase of the project. I mean, I've used it for determine, when we're ready to enter design verification, as an example. And so then the last column is sort of the acceptance criteria. So, here we just elaborate a little more on what it means to, be at the status we're shooting for. So, what does yellow mean in this particular case? And then at the bottom, we have a legend of what green, yellow, and red means. So, really basic tool, but it can be really effective. It becomes really effective when it's used as a communication tool on your development team. And when we can feed it with input from a lot of different stakeholders, whether they be, members of your team or from others outside of your team, like doctors and nurses or FDA. So, just walking through a couple examples that I've added, we've identified some different areas of risk, and Jamison and I have talked a little bit about these already. So these are the buckets of risk, and your project might be different. If we look at this very top one here, so we've got, regulatory and compliance, technical risks, business risks, safety and effectiveness risks. Using the top one here, let's say we've got a great product idea, but, we don't know what the product code is. We're pretty sure, but maybe there's some unique attributes to our device that we're not completely sure how FDA is going to digest them. So, what we decided to do is, after consulting with our regulatory group, maybe with our clinicians, is that, we really need to put in a 513G request with FDA to ensure the product code we selected is appropriate. So, how do you use this in practice? What I found to be most effective is, usually your programmatic or technical leader of your project. So, maybe your PM or your systems engineer starts to develop this chart. And then we bring in a group of stakeholders to really review and update this chart as it makes sense. And so you're going to see some risks start to bubble up as you get input from your team. Cross-functional team is critical here, making sure you have all the right stakeholders.
This is a very useful tool and one that we've used in projects because a lot of people who aren't intimately connected with the project, who are responsible for a lot of those drivers we mentioned at the beginning, will be pushing for quicker implementation, holding on to schedules and things like that. And so being able to concisely and accurately communicate the risks that might affect the profitability of that project itself are very important. And it's one of these things that not only are you identifying the risk, but when that risk comes to a level that you can then move on. And so even people who aren't skilled in the particular category we're talking about are able to understand the risks and why it would be a risk to move forward. And it is a tool. It's a tool that allows us to kind of run these projects more effectively and kind of hold still, keep that biscuit on our nose until it's the right time to move forward.
Yep. So, tie this back into our discussion of, overall project risk reduction. This is really the tool that I found that's, most effective in really creating this bottom curve, this, flattening the curve that Eric Honor talked about in his paper. So what's going to happen is you're going to see this spike very early on because we're going to identify all these new risks, all these new concerns that may or may not be issues. But the point here is that overall the area under our curve is going to be less, and think about that area under the curve as the development time, the development cost. So I like to think of the risk signal chart as sort of like the architectural drawings if you're building a house, right? This isn't necessarily the tool that helps you mitigate the risks at the lower level, whether they be regulatory risks or technical risks. This is really the tool that sort of sits above all the other tools to really track and communicate and to mitigate these risks that we identify. So what we want to do now is go through some of the tools in our toolbox for each of these different areas of risk, and talk about which ones we find effective, which ones should be part of your toolbox or your toolkit in mitigating these risks and these phases of the project. So we're going to start with regulatory and compliance risk. So when I say regulatory, I mean regulations. So this would be, if we're talking about the US, 21 CFR 820, for example. In the EU, it would be the MDR, the medical device regulations. And then compliance would be, primarily compliance to international standards like ISO 14971, IEC 60601, things like that. So the first one I think that's most important or most beneficial in my experience is a good, robust regulatory strategy. I'd say in most cases, I'd recommend a regulatory strategy for any product that's being taken to market. And the reason is, although a lot of people may think, regulations are black and white, there really are a lot of gray areas. And the regulatory strategy is really helpful to identify what those gray areas are, as well as the black and white ones too. Like in some cases, maybe the product code and classification may be pretty straightforward, but maybe your predicate devices are quite a bit different than your product or your proposed product. So in that case, maybe your regulatory strategy dictates that you need to have a pre-submission meeting with FDA through the QSUB process. And in multiple instances, I found that companies that have regulatory strategies and picked a path to market that FDA didn't agree with, but because they had that regulatory strategy and a fairly sound justification around that, that did help with a lot of the issues in dealing with FDA on the post-market side of things.
Right. It doesn't necessarily mean that you've solved it, but that you have the strategy there. And that's kind of what those key components is. It's a delicate balance of how much you do here. But using this risk tool, if you can make those downstream activities predictable, you've probably resolved the level of risk to where you need to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a lot of these other bullets, in my mind, really should fall into that regulatory strategy. So your regulatory strategy should call out how you're going to deal with all these other items. So, do you need a QSUB? Are you going to submit a 513G based on this uncertainty? What predicate devices are out there and how are they similar or different from your device? So moving on to technical and business risk. So I lumped these two together here. Technically all the risks that we put on this risk signal chart are business risks in a way, but usually what I put in business risks are things like internal milestones or particular financial goals. In technical risks, when I think people think of feasibility or research, technical risks are usually the first things that people think of, like making sure that our prototypes are going to work like we expect them to, or maybe we're evaluating this piece of new technology to make sure that we, have reasonable confidence that we can take it through formal design controls. I'd say a lot of times in these areas, we see a lot of effort around testing, components of a system that we're developing. And usually that's the differentiator between the product that we're developing and something that's already out on the market, right? So what are those key technical features that really differentiate you from the rest of your competitors out there? So maybe it's a laser cutting device instead of a mechanical cutting device or something like that. And usually in this phase or in these types of risks, I usually lump in risks around understanding and translating user needs into requirements for the system, or maybe understanding where we might have gaps in what the users want and how our system and our system architecture might meet those needs. And a lot of times in this phase, especially when you're in the feasibility, all these efforts are a little more abstract and maybe not very well defined, like a formal requirements document or a system design and architecture document. Because really we want to focus our efforts on the particular areas that are challenging from a technical perspective, or that aren't very well understood from a user needs perspective. So Jamison, you want to talk a little bit more about some of the user research side of things and the needs definition that's really critical here?
Sure, especially when we're trying to resolve the technical and the business risks. It's really important to know where we're going to end up. And so by identifying some of those late stream processes, we can resolve the risks early on in this. Also using the signal risk chart to clearly identify some of the highest risk issues, we can strategically apply our resources to solve them now rather than later. For example, plastic part injection molding using existing materials and processes does not represent a very high risk, and it's not necessarily something that we need to solve early on before we lock in. But if it's invention on the critical path, if it's a novel design or novel technology or novel application, that's something that we're going to want to spend a lot of time in and dig deep in. At Priority, we have a lot of engineers and designers, a lot of prototype and soft good specialists who work in this early phase feasibility to make sure that we have articulated that both it is feasible and we have a pathway of success before we flip that switch. Another big concern that can't be understated is usability of products, particularly products that are being used for the first time in some certain application, or where we're implementing a novel interface or methodology. And so, our researchers, our human factors researchers, doing a lot of formative studies up front just to kind of identify if there are any concerns, and if those concerns can be addressed through the design of the product itself. So using the signal risk chart to identify these things, solving these issues up front in the feasibility as opposed to in design controls allows us to quickly and efficiently resolve issues that might potentially jeopardize the project and cause really unforeseen delays, because predictable elements are much easier to plan for as a corporation than some of the unforeseen things that pop up. And I kind of relate all of these activities to like planning a vacation. You don't have to plan every single minute of your vacation. I know some people like to do that, but you don't have to plan every single minute. You have to make sure that you can afford that vacation, that you know how you're going to get there, and you kind of know what you're going to do when you get there, and that all this stuff it will be there for you. It's much easier to plan that vacation when you're sitting on the couch than it is when you're in the air in the plane about to land. So the more you can do early on to make yourself feel comfortable at those later phases, we would recommend doing.
Yep. And just to wrap this section up, project planning is a really valuable exercise at this point in time. Again, just building in dependencies of, this has to come before that. So, think about things like sterility validation and things that sort of require final products and then have a big timeline associated with them. So, again, a cross-functional team, making sure we understand, what the big dependencies are, what the critical path is. You don't have to have a schedule that's 1,000 lines long and infinite level of detail, but some sort of middle ground where you can at least understand what comes before something else. And again, cross-functional team is critical there. So then moving on to another category, patient operator safety. A lot of this process is guided by ISO 14971, but I try to get my customers thinking about this as early as they can. And there are lots of safety risk management tools that we can employ early on in a project that are really highly effective at identifying and ultimately designing out these potential safety risks before they even come to life in a prototype. And I think the sooner we can think about and design out those risks, the more cost effective our program is going to be. So, if you're working in the medical device space, you've definitely heard of ISO 14971. There are a lot of other standards that integrate that risk management process, like IEC 60601. And they're all rooted in developing a safe product and really tie into that top level standard 14971. So I find the best approach early on in a project is what we call preliminary hazard analysis, which is really a top-down view of risks or expected risks for the product we're developing, where we start out and we just sort of brainstorm, okay, well, what areas could result in electrical shock, or where could we have a sharps issue or a mechanical hazard with this project? And then we, again, it's a cross-functional team. It should include clinicians as part of that discussion. But we work to identify and weed out those risks before we even put pen to paper, before we sit down in front of our CAD station.
It's an excellent tool for us to be able to separate the must-haves from the nice-to-haves, particularly when we're dealing with highly marketable products, to make sure that we've identified those key things that cannot be sacrificed in the design, make sure those are included. And then at the same time, understanding the nice-to-haves, seeing opportunities we have for putting those back in.
Yep. And then, it doesn't mean we have to formalize our risk management process at this point in time, or formalize our preliminary hazard analysis. But going through the exercise, at the very least, of thinking through these different categories of hazards and how we might mitigate those in the design is very beneficial. And I've seen, the earlier we can do this, even if it's just a quick meeting to start out before we start developing prototypes, the better.
Oh, I forgot our cue. So Chad, when is the best time to flip that switch?
Yeah, and so I know we've been like teasing every one of you here in this through this entire presentation. And my answer and my favorite answer to everything is it depends. And that's the answer that makes so many people mad, but it really does depend. It depends on risk, and it depends on your particular project. In a nutshell, if we bite down our risk to the point where we feel like we've mitigated, most of those major risks, those big risks, and we can start to work on the final embodiment of the device, that's sort of where we need to be. I think it's important to note that, it doesn't have to be a discrete flip. It can think of it more like a dimmer switch, right? Where you can sort of transition out of that research phase or that feasibility phase into design controls, depending on what area that we're working in. So, for example, and it's going to be different on every program. So, we might, in some cases, we might have our user needs really well defined, and, maybe some of our initial safety risks are really well defined. So, maybe we kick off some of our design inputs early on. So we develop a project plan, we develop our safety risk management plan, things like that. So, but we can still work on some of our technical feasibility challenges in parallel. So really nothing should be done in a vacuum. Don't feel like it's a hard stop. Hopefully your product development process doesn't make it a hard stop. And again, we're trying to approach our development project with this overall risk reduction model in mind. So, flattening that risk curve, where we identify and address those particular risks early on. So, sure, we're going to spend a little more time and money early on. When we do get to design controls, or, really at any point in the subsequent, development process, we're less likely to discover and to have to mitigate those risks, that can really derail a project. So when you flip it, determine it based on risk, using the tools in your toolkit, using some of the tools Jamison and I have talked about, using some that you've developed internally or that you like. Flip that switch based on input from your cross-functional team. So that's critical, including the voices of your stakeholders. So the end users, the patients, the clinicians, the regulators, all those should be considered. And if you've gotten that far, you've done a much better job than a lot of other companies. So, this is a hard thing to do. This is an uphill battle, especially if you're working with the business and finance side of things. But having a way to really systematically track and reduce those risks is really the key to doing this effectively.
Yeah, and I think for us, using the signal risk chart to manage those things, to be able to create high levels of visibility to those, and to be able to strategically define our work product, especially early on when there's so much that needs to be done. Using a tool like the signal risk chart, working with our clients to identify the key elements that need to be resolved early on, and the certain things that can be pushed back that have more predictable development pathways. It's been a very effective tool for us, and we've used it to to manage the projects and ultimately save time and cost for our clients.
So we had some fun examples. We're running a little late on time, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. But we've seen examples on both sides of the fence where companies will enter design controls too soon and then have to deal with the implications of discovering risks very late in the project. And in some cases, we see that they start too late too. Especially if when you're working in the startup world, it's like, well, what do you mean what are design controls? Like, we've already got this product, we're ready to ship it. So there's a happy balance, and there's definitely a big range there, but there's a happy balance in the middle, and it's really using those tools to figure out when the best time is for your particular project and your particular risks. So we wanted to talk a little bit about our own sort of personal best practices here. Jamison, I'll go first. So I mentioned I worked on a lot of different programs, with a lot of medical device companies. But if you haven't been able to tell already, there's not, really one magical tool I like to use other than that risk signal chart. Pretty much every project that's in this sort of late feasibility, early design control space, I'm always using this risk signal chart. I think it's a great tool to communicate with stakeholders. Red, yellow, green. It's pretty easy to see what's going on. And then again, communication is the key, right? Especially if you got large teams, a lot of activities going on, lots of stakeholders. Being able to communicate those risks effectively. And what is your plan to mitigate those risks and mitigating those risks effectively? That's the reason this was the top level tool in our discussion, and why we wanted to present it.
Right.
I also have sort of a background in Design for Six Sigma, DFSS, and there's a lot of great tools in that toolkit too. Doesn't necessarily mean you're designing to a Six Sigma level of quality, but just gives you a lot of great tools to sort of ensure a predictable development process. So I also use House of Quality and Quality Function Deployment quite a bit, which I think came out of the automotive industry in the 80s. It's a really great tool to help you transition from those user needs and the priority of those user needs into actionable design requirements. And then finally, good project plan loaded with dependencies. Work breakdown structures are great, especially if you're trying to scope a project. And dealing with that sort of uncertainty level that you have early on in the project. And background is also in systems engineering, so using those systems engineering tools from INCOSE, which is the International Council on Systems Engineering. They have a great systems engineering handbook that can really help you help guide you through complex projects like some of the medical devices that we work with. Jamison?
Yeah, for me, a lot of this is about having visibility to the end of the project and how you're going to get there. I think it's often very obvious for a lot of the technical risks that you might have. And so those are easy to understand, those are easy to predict. And often this actual activity is very intuitive in completing a project, that you take the highest risk items and you knock them off. By using the signal risk chart, we expand that exposure to include all elements of the project that may potentially sidetrack it. And so it's a very effective tool for us for getting a holistic view of the project and for quickly identifying what are those things that we don't know yet. What are the things that are going to potentially derail this project, that create unpredictable budgets and timelines, and how do we reduce that risk? And in reducing the risk, we actually are also reducing the time and the cost. So it's been a very good tool for us to use, and we appreciate Chad, working with our company.
Okay, yeah, I think Wade, we're probably ready for questions now if we still have time.
Sounds good. Yeah, we'll try to squeeze a few here in the last minute or so that we have.
But yeah, perfectly.
Very strategic.
Not a problem. Yeah, you guys, this was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. A lot of great comments coming in the questions section about all of your guys' information here. So one big question I did want to hit that was coming up a lot in the Q&A session was if you guys could talk a little bit about the difference between the risk signal chart and a 14971 risk assessment.
Sure. So I think the risk signal chart can include elements of safety risk. So having a certain section that maybe sort of bubbles up those major safety risks that you're talking about. But really, I see it as being a separate tool that can feed your risk management process, but doesn't necessarily become part of your risk management file. I see this more as an overall project management and project risk reduction tool. But in the world of medical devices, safety risk is one of those primary objectives of reducing those. So I'd say they complement each other, but I wouldn't necessarily intermingle the technical risk signal chart or the risk signal chart in with your safety risk management file.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that answer. And we're actually running low on time, so I'm going to wrap things up here. I'm going to get to many of these questions, but good news is Jamison and Chad are going to get a list of all the questions that you guys submitted throughout this webinar, so they will be able to follow up with answers to all of your guys' questions. So thank you. Appreciate all of the questions. Thank you again to Chad and Jamison for presenting today. This was really great. Thank you for everyone for attending. Just as a reminder, in about 10 minutes, there's another session coming up on design considerations to maximize medical device cloud connectivity. So if you're interested in that, you can register, use that unique link to tune in. But just wanted to give a big thanks to Chad and Jamison again, and everyone for attending, and take care.
All right,
Thank you.
thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.